might have felt like putting his feet up after losing the Tory leadership to Liz Truss. But just weeks later, he had his nose to the grindstone, moving into number 10 to placate the markets and try to calm down the public. He's here now, and as John was saying, we're delighted to have you here for a live interview. So let's find out what kind of Prime Minister you really want to be. You've come out as a big supporter of drivers, talking about the war on motorists. Now, we've had a look at some of the people who are fighting what you call that war. One of them is in Cornwall, where the council is proposing a speed limit of 20 miles an hour, the kind you say is anti-British. But they're a Conservative council. Are they fighting a war against motorists?
Well, good morning, Laura. Fantastic to be with you. And when it comes to this point around driving, you know, what it occurred to me as I was going around the country talking to people, that there just seemed to be this sense that lots of people wanted to stop making life easy for people to use their cars. And I didn't think that was
good, based, love to see it. Very happy to see car users get continually inconvenienced, specifically in city centres, right? I'm not saying we should reduce the speed limit to 20 miles an hour in rural Yorkshire.
Right, cars for most people are the form of transport that they rely on the most.
Yeah, and that's your fault, because you've not built enough trains or funded our buses.
It's a freedom that it gives you. It's the ability to just get around and do your day-to-day life. And for too many people, it felt like everyone was trying to stop.
The fact, like the framing of this question as well, has allowed him to completely avoid talking about any of the real issues with the failures of this policy or the opportunism of this policy. It basically just becomes, without any actual proper scrutiny or pushback, it just becomes like an election campaigning video for Sunak, really and truly. But then again, I guess that's what the BBC is to the Conservative Party.
Them doing that, imposing on them blanket speed restrictions. That's what we've seen in Wales from the Labour government there, blanket 20 mile an hour.
We've had a close look at what's happening in Wales, and it's very similar to what this Conservative council in Cornwall is proposing. And also even in your own part of the world, in North Yorkshire, there are, I think, more than 100 parish councils who want to have a 20 mile an hour limit. So if you think it's the wrong thing, as you've explained, will you stop Conservative councils bringing in these plans?
Yeah, this is about local people being in the driving seat, and it's about making sure that things are not imposed on local communities without their consent. Now, of course, it makes sense to have speed limits around, for example, school areas. Everyone wants safety.
True, absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. So just let the community get involved, because of course, who cares about minorities of people who want to be pedestrians or use public transport? Those people are irrelevant, because we have engineered a situation where everybody has to drive, and therefore they become the majority. So they have majority control over what we do or don't do. It's exactly what they did with housing, where we made sure that everyone was either private renters, landlords, or owner-occupiers rather than social ownership. So we gave the people who own the property the majority share of the country as far as voting is concerned.
For our children. But these things need to be done with consent, and it can't be part of this war on motorists. And that's why, for example, when I was Chancellor, I cut fuel duty by record amounts to help people with...
And yeah, as was pointed out by Donny Marco in chat, you can't talk about consent or mandates for anything, Rishi, when nobody voted for you. No one voted for you to be Prime Minister. Not even members of your own party voted for you to be Prime Minister. And barely any of the actual MPs in the Parliamentary Conservative Party voted for you to be Prime Minister as well. You have no mandate and no support. For you to say having things imposed upon them, I'm having things imposed upon me by you without there being a democratic vote on any of the matters. Given that hitting net zero was a manifesto promise that you ran on as part of the Conservative election campaign under Boris Johnson in 2019.
The cost of living, because again, cars are important. It's why we've seen, actually, again, you were talking about ULEZ earlier, this idea that ordinary families should be forced to pay £12.50 just to take their kids to school, to do the weekly shop. You know, all of these things don't strike me as being right for our country. And it's right that we reset the balance here and respect and recognise that people do rely on their cars.
But I'd like to be really clear about what you're actually proposing here. So our viewers will have heard you express sympathy for people who think driving's pretty tough these days. But I want to...
But it's like no even scrutiny of the idea that the war on motorists even exists in the first place. It's like, okay, well, you said there's war on motorists, but what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about this war on motorists? It doesn't exist. It's nonsense. This is a figment of his imagination.
To be really clear about what you're actually proposing, will you stop councils, whether they're Conservative, Labour or any colour of the rainbow, will you stop them introducing 20 mile an hour zones as a default? Because that's really what's at stake here. You can complain about it, as lots of our viewers might do, but are you going to stop it happening? Because if you don't, then it's just rhetoric, isn't it?
No, what this is about is making sure that the statutory guidance that goes to local councils from government is clear about making sure that councils, which are obviously in charge of what's happening in their local areas, are doing things with the support and consent of their local communities.
But if they
taking
have
into into account the needs of their community.
But if they have
and
that,
not
then they can
imposing
crack
things
on
them without their
But if
consent
they have
and say
that,
so.
they can crack
But,
on. You're
what I
not
don't
going
want
to
to do is
block
obviously
them.
I mean, they have consent for 20-mile an hour speed limits. They voted for the Labour government in Wales. Like, what do you think the Senedd is there for? Like, there is a democratic mandate for this stuff because Labour are in control and it's a devolved area.
The Transport Secretary is going to set out the detail of this in his speech
But hang on,
later
you've been
on.
talking about this for the last few days.
Yes,
You're trying
we've
to
been
make a
talking-
big
yeah.
pitch on this. I want to be really clear. What you've just said is if local councils who are democratically elected, if they want to do it, they should be allowed to do it.
Yeah, what they should be allowed to do in all cases is act in accordance with the government guidance. And that's what we're going to bring forward, is making sure that the
So if the government guidance is they can't do it, then it doesn't matter what the democracy of the people who lives there is. Maybe we might even have a position where there is a majority decision for the imposition of 20-mile-an-hour speed limits by people who use public transport in like central Cardiff or Swansea or whatever. But that might get overruled by the government saying that they can't do that, which would be against the idea of local ownership and local control.
the guidance to councils about how these things are done is done with regard to the needs and wants of local
So you won't
communities. And
block
what we've
them.
seen in you've seen what we've seen in Labour-run Wales, a blanket imposition of a
But my
20 mile
question
an
is
hour
what you
speed
will do.
limit.
What you're
And
saying
you've
to
seen
us this
hundreds
morning
of
is that you
thousands
won't
of
block
people
it. But what you've-
have risen
but
up
what you're
against
saying
that
this
and
morning
signed a petition,
is if
and that
local
gives you a sense of the strength of feeling.
I just, I tell you what, this is literally just refusing to let Laura Kearnsberg talk and Rishi just talking over her. Why is every single Conservative in this country just Alan Partridge?
You can keep pear tree productions going with a skeleton staff of 2.
There's no point finishing the sentence then because I'm not driving a mini metro.
But if it...
Then I'll just speak over you. Go on, try and finish the sentence and see what I do.
It's literally Rishi Sunak right now.
Go on.
With a
I'm
skeleton
not driving a
staff
mini
of
metro.
2.
I'm not driving a mini metro.
This is literally what we're watching right now.
this issue, and I want people to know that we are on their side.
But what you have said is if local communities and local councils who are democratically elected want to do it, they can do it. And that is an important point, because I think some of this in the last few days, people might think, your love for motorists seems to have come to you in the Conservative Party quite recently. It was a Conservative government that told cities...
Wow, it's almost like it's entirely manufactured to try and create a culture war that doesn't exist, to try and pull people's votes over cynically. What a wild suggestion there, Laura, that maybe they've only just immediately decided to be pro-motorist whilst their polls were in the doldrums and they didn't have anything else to campaign on. What a crazy coincidence, Laura. I can't believe you'd noticed.
all over the country to bring in clean air zones, which was tough for the drivers of older vehicles. It was a Conservative mayor who first introduced and announced the low emission zone in London. Conservative councils have been introducing 20-mile-an-hour zones. And, a sceptic might just wonder if your newfound passion for this agenda comes from the fact that you've been in the doldrums in the polls for a long time, and yet you hung on in Uxbridge, in the London suburb, by campaigning against the low emission zone that your party put forward as a plan. That's what's happening here, isn't it?
I guess the bit that you failed to mention, Laura, that when I was Chancellor, I cut fuel duty by a record amount. So
As previous chancellors did before you,
I cut
with
it. But no,
long-running
what
campaigns.
previous chancellors did was...
And also, the justification for cutting fuel duty was to try and take the ease off of the increase in prices because of the war in Ukraine. That was the reason for the reduction in fuel duty, was to try and alleviate the issues of the fact that petrol had massively spiked because of external factors to the economy. He wasn't doing it because he loves motorists. It was just kind of an obvious decision to ensure that demand for consumption in the economy wasn't suppressed by the oil shock.
Fuel duty, what I did was cut it by the largest amount, pretty much on record. That saves drivers £100 a year over the past year. I did that a long time ago. And you talked about ULEZ. Now, all I'd say is, when it came to charting a new course on net zero, which I set out the other day, I set out a way to get there more pragmatic, more proportionate, more realistic, and that will save families £5, 10, 15, £20,000.
Well, those figures are a bit disputed about who will save
hang
how
on.
much
If
just
I could,
when.
If I could just finish the point.
Of course.
Now, I charted out that new course on net zero. That wasn't some knee-jerk reaction to the Uxbridge by-election. I, for a long time, have had concerns about the cost.
I mean, literally, there was a tweet I saw the other day, I retweeted it as well, which just describes the situation here, which is like, the Uxbridge by-election is like when you mention to an aunt one year that you like pandas, and then every single year you get something panda-themed for Christmas for decades and decades and decades. And this what the Uxbridge by-election feels like, which of course is partly because that the Conservative Party have found one thing they can win on outside of everything else that they're losing on. But it's obviously partly because Labour's communications on this one was terrible, in that their comms department decided to communicate to the press that they were nailed on to win the by-election. And of course, they never were nailed on to win. Uxbridge is a very, very Tory constituency, and like backbone Tory constituency. It's not like the kind of culture warriors of the north who vote Tory on social policy. These are hardline liberal with a capital L conservatives who want free markets, who don't want big government, and they were never going to vote for Labour in a million years. It's quite frankly a surprise that Labour did as well as they did in Uxbridge. Despite the fact they didn't win, they got very, very close, which is a good result for them. But because their comms were terrible in the run-up to the by-election, where they were telling everybody they were going to win, it gifted the Conservatives this whole new line of attack that didn't need to be there.
That were being asked of working families when it came to meeting these net zero targets, and I came to the view that we could meet what are world-leading targets, by the way, because we're doing more than anyone else, but we could do it in a more pragmatic and realistic way that saves people costs, not unnecessarily having to switch their cars, replace their boilers, particularly in rural areas. That's what I did. Look, I get that there'll be criticism of that decision. I'm fine with it because I think it's the right long-term decision for our country.
But that's interesting, because you say you had these concerns about the costs that the net zero targets were imposing for a long time. Now, you were at the cabinet table busily supporting Boris Johnson's net zero targets. Is it the case that you disagreed with him privately and you were raising these concerns? Or have you only just realised how serious the cost might potentially have been? Which is it?
I've raised these concerns in the past, but I've been Prime Minister for less than a year, and now I'm the one responsible for it.
But so when you were Chancellor, you were unhappy about the targets?
Of course, I raised concerns at the time about the costs that were going to be put on families. And one of the points I made the other week is when we debate these things in Parliament, what I'd like to see next time around, when we set a carbon budget in Parliament that says this is how we're going to reduce carbon emissions, at the same time, the country should also be considering all the things that are required to meet that budget. That seems to me to be the sensible way to do this. What I don't like is the way that we've done this in the past, because it's not being honest with people. That's not the kind of leadership that I want to bring. I want to...
The guy who was making up fake meat taxes and inventing 7 bins not a week ago is in no position to lecture anybody on being honest with the public. Heaven forfend. Jesus. And yeah, exactly, no families have to change their cars or their boilers. Landlords have to change boilers, and people buying new cars will have to go electric. It's not about people having to get forced to scrap petrol cars. I mean, you could argue, and maybe there's some point to the idea that there are people who have ULEZ uncompliant vehicles who will have to scrap and replace that vehicle to avoid the charge, which is, I guess, some kind of coercion. But there's no law mandating anybody has to change any cars.
Do things differently, because if we want to change our country, we have to approach politics differently, and this is an example of it.
But
it's me being upfront about what's required, saying that these are the costs that were being put on people. I don't agree with them. I think we can still get there without them. I'm confident of that. We're not walking away from any of our targets,
can you be
which are
honest
world
about this,
leading.
though?
And that, I think, is actually a position that will command the broad support of the British people.
But can you be honest about this, though? Is that by slowing down the pace of hitting the net zero target, which you've explained that you wanted to do and you had concerns about some time, pretty much every single environmental expert, including lots of Conservatives who care passionately about this, say the obvious logic here is that you are slowing down the UK's progress to hitting its climate targets.
And also, even if you think that it's expensive, which actually, to be fair, it is, as Morinaka points out in chat, is actually incorrect, that there's a Tufton Street think tank that produced a net zero report estimating the cost and wildly misattributing how much it would cost, right? So Civitas are the ones who did the report, claiming that achieving net zero would cost $4.5 trillion. And actually, that's not true. So they go into all of the information on this one here, saying that the £810 billion figure per year, or so the capital expenditure on onshore wind farms, is also a miscalculation. They massively by factors of like 6 factors of 10 out of how much the capital expenditure per megawatt hour of electricity from wind turbines would cost. And that's where a lot of their estimations are coming from, is the amount of yearly infrastructure expenditure that have to go on new wind farms, which is the vast majority of this £4.5 trillion estimation. when loads of it is just this ridiculously out of touch figure here. And even then, right, we know that it has to happen eventually. We know that we're going to have to engage in this just transition eventually. And the longer we wait, the more expensive that it will be. The longer that we have to kick the can down the road, the more money that we'll spend. Did we not learn from 2010 to 2019 that lack of investment now means paying over the odds tomorrow? Where in 2010 to 2019, we weren't investing in schools, and now they're collapsing, and we'll have to spend even more than we would have done if we'd had a proper capital investment budget at the time. It's the exact same principle with our failures on net zero.
And that is a short-term political calculation because you've had heat from the right in your party about the green agenda. Rightly or wrongly, can you be honest with everybody watching this morning and say, sure, politics is part of it, because you were worried about it being unpopular?
Absolutely not, because I'm focused on doing what I believe is right for the country in the long term. I've had these concerns for a long time. Here are the facts. Let's just go over the facts of what you said. We've already decarbonised faster than any other major G7 economy. That's a fact. We all have a set of targets for how much we're going to decarbonise by 2030. Again, who's the best? We are, down 68%.
That's not really a reason to give.
But no, but that's what you've gone back on, right? I think it's admirable that Boris Johnson wanted to continue to adhere to the idea that we should be world leading, in our approach to net zero by bringing forward a bunch of targets above the EU average. That's a good thing to want to aspire to. And you're now downgrading that aspiration. Like, why do you not want to be an aspirational country, Rishi? I thought that's what the Conservatives were the party of. There's a sort of thing that the left of centre liberals do with regards to solution for climate change. They pretend it's your shopping list of nice things like trains and recycled material park benches, but we'll have to topple entire industries just to ameliorate the effects of climate change. Exactly. Change our whole kind of system of production. Will he exit government before an election to save face? We might have a snap election very, very soon. So we'll see.
Give up something because you're good at it, isn't it?
No, hang on. We are going to meet these targets while we're decarbonising faster than everybody else, faster than Europe,
and there are
America,
plenty of
Australia,
analysts, including
Canada, Japan.
the independent watchdog on this, says that actually we're
Laura,
likely to be
if I could just finish, because it's really important. We are not off track. We are not off track.
Yes, we are off track. We literally are off track. Bear with us 1 second. I have the graph here somewhere. Sorry about the wait here. Yeah, there we go. This was before they rode back on commitments. Our emissions, as far as getting towards the target, were already off track. And the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, which is run by a Conservative, this was Alok Sharma at the time, I believe, and the Climate Change Committee have already predicted that we were going to miss the target. And that was before they backtracked on a bunch of stuff.
Other countries are behind us. We're ahead of them. We're going to continue to be ahead of them. We have an obligation to meet these targets. We will meet them. That's what all our analysis says, but we can do so in a more proportionate, pragmatic way that saves families thousands of pounds. Now, for all the critics, which you are right, there are critics of what we're doing. The question for them is, why do they think it's right to impose costs of 5, 10, 15, 20,000 pounds on families to do something that we don't think is necessary to meet world-leading net zero targets? It's fine to criticise me. It's fine.
But that wasn't happening. There was no expectation for families to be forced to spend 15,000 to 20,000 pounds on anything. So when Sunak says that people haven't been honest about the true costs of climate initiatives, it's partly true, because people are ignoring the fact we have to crush oil and coal fat cats. I mean, that is also true.
Fine to disagree, but then you have to explain to families why you think
that's
it's
a question that we've asked to many people on this programme over
I don't
recent
think it
months.
is, and that's why we're charting a new course. And that's an example of doing things differently and doing the right thing for the country in the long term.
Well, let's talk about another long-term decision, and I'm glad.
Nick Laughlin, he's worse than Johnson. It's official. Oh, he was always going to be worse than Johnson, right? I had zero doubt that he would be worse than Johnson. I did a whole segment about it during the leadership election too. Let me find it. Oh, I will freely admit that I want Boris Johnson back. I will not shy away from saying that I want Boris Johnson back. I mean, look, it's just clear that he's better than most of the Conservative theoretical prime ministers. Look, 11 months ago, Boris is unironically the lesser evil. I told everybody that he would be better than Rishi. It was obvious that he'd be better than Rishi. But in the terms of a lot of kind of liberal types, like centrist vibe types, Boris had the worst vibe because he was the man with the floppy hair who wasn't sensible. Now, Boris Johnson is a bad politician and a bad human who has said and done racist and homophobic things, tried to prorogue Parliament illegally, lied to the Queen, conspired to have a journalist beaten up, and was the progenitor of hard Brexit because of following Theresa May's red lines, who did so completely cynically for something he didn't believe in to try and become Prime Minister for his own personal reasons. He's a bad man. He's not a good Prime Minister and was not a good Prime Minister. But at least he did policy for what people wanted. He did popular policy. He invested in the NHS. He uprated benefits in line with inflation. He wanted to level up the country. He wanted to meet net zero. In fact, he was in the Daily Express last week, explicitly criticising criticising Rishi Sunak for climbing down on net zero. That's how much better of a politician Boris Johnson is than Rishi Sunak. And this, of course, this is Boris Johnson we're speaking about. This is an absolutely vile Prime Minister who should have been in that position in the first place. And out here, being more progressive than Rishi Sunak. I knew it. I told you. I told everybody. I told everyone that was the case.
You mentioned tracks there, because there's a seamless move on to talk about the railways. We are sitting in Salford, right next to Manchester. Yes or no, will HS2, high-speed rail, come to this part of the world?
There's already spades in the ground on HS2 and we're getting on with delivering
That's not my
it.
question. Yes or no, is it coming here?
I'm not going to comment on all this speculation. We've got a project, we've got spades in the ground and we're getting on with it. But it's right to focus on levelling up. Because
Can I just stop you there? You were the Prime Minister of this country. This is not asking you about speculation. You're not a columnist. You're not a backbencher with an axe to grind. You're not someone from the rail industry. You are the Prime Minister of this country.
Wow, I can't... Well, look at that. Look at Laura Kearnsberg actually putting the boot in once for the first time ever. That's surprising. I'm surprised that Laura Kearnsberg has actually decided to skewer him for the fact that he continually tries to run away from the point or tries to speculate rather than be concrete. She's absolutely correct. You can't prevaricate on this stuff when you are the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. You are the person who decides how policy gets crafted. It's your job to lead and make these decisions, with the help of the cabinet, of course, but you are the leading voice on these things. You can't just sit here and pretend not to have policy or to be waiting for other people to do things. You're not the opposition. You are the Prime Minister. You're in government. She's only allowed to temporarily rent the official BBC spine. True. Oh no, she won't be like this to Starmer. It's true, she won't be like that to Starmer. Yeah. Funny how she was never like this in 2019. True. So true. So true. Yeah, they were fine doing this to Corbyn, but there was no way they were ever going to do this to Johnson, were they? No, she let Johnson off the hook. Mr. Hide in a fucking fridge.
This is your decision. Is this going to happen or not?
As I said, we've got spades in the ground. I'm not going to comment on further speculation, but what I can tell you we are doing is absolutely committed to levelling up across this country. Just today, we've announced a new plan to put a long-term plan, actually.
Oh God, where's Paxman? Where's Paxman when you need him? Where's Paxman? To just repeat the question over and over and over again. Where is Paxman? We need him more than ever. I hate to be like an absolutely shameless lib and stand somebody like Paxman, but it's just the desire for somebody to just continually ask the same question until they answer it satisfactorily is what this political and journalism class is missing in this country. Spades in the ground, free centre square. Literally, Sunak bingo. She was fine with having Dominic Cummings having her number on speed dial, lest we forget. Well, of course, it's all about access for these people. It's all a fucking rigged game.
To focus on people in towns. More people live in towns and live in big cities in our country, and they don't get the attention that they deserve. And my view is that we need to focus on the long-term things that will make our towns better places to live, put local people in control, and that's why we're backing them with £1 billion.
Yeah, client journalism. Client and court journalism. You're absolutely right. Those are excellent ways of describing it.
Pounds of funding to help 55 towns across the country to help them level up, better high streets, more security, less homelessness, in making sure that they protect civic assets. And they're going to be given long-term endowment funding, £20 million per town, empowering local people, putting them in charge of those decisions to help support them.
You hate the levelling up nonsense, nowhere is improving. I think rhetorically levelling up is a good thing. We do want to see the North equated with the South in terms of economic investment and prosperity, etc., etc. But the problem is that just giving money for individual projects is not enough. The levelling up fund is a replacement for the fact that they've stripped local councils of all of their funding, exactly as we were talking about earlier on in the week about the amount of council assets that have been sold off to cover budget deficits. They can say, look, we've levelled up by funding this singular project in your area, despite the fact that all of the actual amenities that you want and use in your local authority have all been sold off to private equity firms because your council budgets haven't been large enough to be able to continue the upkeep on what should be locally and collectively owned amenities. But locally and collectively owned amenity doesn't make money for the Conservative Party donor base. What does is forcing councils to sell them off.
That's an example of levelling up in action that this Conservative government is delivering today.
And many people might be pleased to hear about that this morning. But you say there again you are committed to long-term decisions, and yet you are visibly refusing to make a long-term decision at this stage about HS2. You've even got it branded on your slogan at the conference, long-term decisions for a brighter future. And yet you won't tell people the decision on HS2. And it's not just about your political critics picking you up on this. It's also people in your own party. Businesses are alarmed by your wobbling on this decision. Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands, a Conservative, says the wobbling over HS2 risks making the UK look a laughing stock
I mean, it's true. It's literally true. We build nothing. We are stagnating as a country because we build nothing. We build nothing at all. And what was pointed out by one of the panelists on Question Time yesterday, what shows that there's just no legacy for Rishi to leave behind because he's done nothing. There's no long-term decisions. In fact, it's the opposite. We've got short-term decisions for a brighter election campaign. That's all that we've got from him. And we're taking all of the long-term projects and long-term solutions and replacing them with nothing. And the Starmer administration that potentially will come through is doing the exact same thing. They're not they keep talking about sticking plaster politics in the opposition, and all they do is have buzzwords and slogans without any proper long-term changes to create a fairer and more just economy. Like... Oh my God, our political class is so awful.
I'd completely reject that. I speak to business leaders all the time. I've just been around the world. I've recently been in Japan, in America, in Europe. We're attracting billions of pounds of investment into this country, creating jobs everywhere. You talk about levelling up. Because of Brexit, we've created free ports in places like Teesside, where there's record investment coming in, supporting the industries of the future.
But I know you care deeply
because
about
we've
the
left the
views of
EU, we can now sign trade deals with the fastest growing parts of the world, like Asia. This is what we're doing. That's what I hear from business leaders around the world. They're excited about the opportunities that investing in Britain offers.
But you know well that there has been concern over changing the goalposts on net zero and on the HS2 wobble on the decision whenever we're going to get it. Changing your mind may be the right thing to do, but it has a cost. I'd just like to play our viewers and play you a clip.
It's become clear to me over recent months that the Conservative Party are drifting out of touch with the needs of business, of the environment, and also the everyday people that my business touches and serves.
No, that's Richard.
See what I mean? When I kept telling you that Conservatives is no longer the de facto party of capital anymore, right? The de facto party of capital is now the Labour Party. What the Conservatives are the party of special interests and racists. It's as simple as that. And conspiracy theorists, they truly have just become a crank party now. They exist to serve the interests of big oil. They exist to serve the interests of grasping simpletons who hate anybody of a different skin colour. And they are only interested in winning off the back of manufactured issues. No, Starmer's Labour's not the capital B team anymore. They're the capital A team. The only people who are offering like stable neoliberalism are the Labour Party. The Conservatives want full-on like disaster capitalism that helps nobody, apart from whichever vested interests own enough stuff that they make the proceeds of what happens when everything falls apart. The people who make the most out of a crisis are the people who want the Tories to win. People who want to make money as capitalists will want to vote Labour, and people who want actual change for real people in this country will vote for anybody else.
Booker, I know some of your colleagues will say he's grumpy because he wanted to be a Conservative MP and hasn't found a seat to run in, but he's the boss of Iceland, which is a big important company in this country. He's hacked off. You've got former Prime Ministers hacked off over your wobble on HS2. You've got a big group of Tory MPs rattling your cage demanding tax cuts. You've even got Michael Gove, your close colleague this morning, saying there should be tax cuts before the general election. With your changes of heart, have you really got your party under control?
So, look, with Richard, as you said, I think he was trying to stand as a Conservative candidate, but, he talked about net zero. He talked about making sure that we're prioritising working people. That's the decision I've made.
But my question is...
You've done neither of... You've literally kicked the net zero can down the road. And working people in this country, not only are living in the biggest dropping living standards since the Napoleonic Wars, they're also having the highest tax burden on actual working and productive people in this country. On top of the fact that you're the Conservative Party. When have you ever cared about working people? That's never been part of the Conservative remit.
The impact of spooking people by changing your mind.
No. Sorry.
Well, Lib Dem's the party of NIMBYs.
Change may be uncomfortable for people. People may be critical of it, but I believe I'm doing the right thing for the country. I'm not going to shy away from that. If I believe the right thing to do is to chart a new course to net zero that will save ordinary families £5, £10, £15, £20,000, I'm going to do it. And whether it's him, whether it's anyone else who wants to be critical of that decision, I'm okay with that. They should be the ones that explain why they think it is right to put those costs on people. Might be fine for them to afford it. It's not fine for everyone else. I don't think it's right.
And
when it comes to taxes, look, I'm a Conservative. Of course I want to cut taxes. The best tax cut that I can deliver for the British people right now is to halve inflation.
Well,
that was why it was the first of my priorities.
It's a feature in the economy, but I want to
Laura,
ask you about Michael Gove's comments this morning.
I think actually, no, if I could, please, because it's really important, because you just said something that I completely disagree with. Inflation is a tax. You just said it isn't.
No, but dropping inflation is not a tax cut, because dropping inflation just changes the amount at which the rate of prices increase, right? The only way that you deliver a cut as far as inflation is concerned is if we have deflation. And deflation is bad. No one wants a deflationary economy. If you really want to put more money in people's pockets, you'll cut taxes on working people. And by that I mean people within the kind of first tax bracket, not people on 45% tax bracket, not people with capital gains, not corporations, but people who actually work and be productive. You deliver them a tax cut and put more money in their pockets, or you'll implement demand-side labour reform so that people get higher wages. But you don't do that. Instead, what you do is you take the singular method that workers have of bargaining for better wages, union action and industrial action, and then in some sectors of the economy, you try and make sure people can be fired for engaging it. Your party's already made it harder for the industrial action to start in the first place by restricting the ballot initiatives of unions to try and engage in strike action in the first place. And now you've got the minimum service order bill as well. If the only way that you can actually make sure that there is more money in people's pockets to spend is through tax cuts and wage increases or deflation. Deflation is bad because it means that people stop spending and the economy grinds to a halt. And tax cuts would lower the revenue for the exchequer. And as we've seen from unfunded tax cuts, the markets don't like that. We might have a further collapse in the gilt market, theoretically, if that happens, without proper oversight from the OBR, etc. So what you're left with is you have to raise people's wages. And you're trying to stop that. In fact, the Bank of England are trying to stop that by raising interest rates.
Inflation is a tax. It's a tax that impacts the poorest people the most. And that is why the best tax cut that I can deliver is to halve inflation.
Well,
and that's why I set it out as the first.
Let's not have
economically.
No, so that's a lie. You're just lying. You're abjectly lying, Rishi.
The
Debate.
impact that it has on people is
But
to eat into their pockets, it eats into their
to you-
wallets,
but
it puts up the prices of things, it effectively acts as a tax.
But what's-
And that is
my
why we
question
must
to you-
bring it down, and that's why we are, and the plans are working.
But my question to you, Prime Minister, this morning is about the impact of the changes that you have been making. And you're explaining that you think they're the right things to do.
Honestly, I just wish that journalists would just raise their voice at people who do this. Just be like, be quiet, answer my question. It's frustrating to watch him just steamroll and talk over. I'm not driving a mini metro, I'm not driving a mini metro, I'm not driving a mini metro. And because Laura Kearnsberg is so cucked, right, to the Conservative Party and Conservative politics, that she just meekly tries to talk whilst he talks over her. It literally is Alan Partridge and Lynn. There's no other way of describing it.
And you're basically saying, bring it on to your critics. But on the one specific, your close colleague, Michael Gove, this morning has said that you should commit to cutting taxes for working people before the next election. Will you make that commitment?
Now, as I said, the best tax cut that we can give working people is to halve inflation.
So you won't make that commitment right now?
So I'm a Conservative. I want to cut taxes.
Yeah.
But people saw very clearly. You asked me about making changes. Change may be difficult, but I believe the country wants change, and I'm going to do things differently to bring about that change. And you saw that last summer when it came to this question. I said
The only tax cut he's actually offering people, potentially, if the leaks are to be believed, is a tax cut on inheritance, which only 4% of the country even pay. But luckily, Rishi Sunak pays a lot of inheritance tax because he's a very, very rich man. So he wants to cut the tax that he would pay on ensuring that his daughters, who didn't choose to be born to a very rich family, get massively unconferred advantages on the rest of the population.
The most important priority we faced was to bring inflation down. It's inflation that's putting the prices of things up.
And you've made that point.
Inflation that's making people feel poorer. The quicker we bring inflation down, the better it is. And that's why it's the right priority. And we are making good progress. And you can start to see in the last few months, the numbers are coming down. We've got to stick to the plan because I know things are tough and there is work to do.
And you've made that point. Who votes?
He treats it like a campaign opportunity. You can see that every line that he has is just all being rehearsed. I mean, just like anyone on the Labour front bench, let's be real. It's all very similar to the Labour front bench in truth. They all just are spin doctor derived lines that they've rehearsed over and over and over again in the mirror before taking the interview, which is why he keeps talking over her, is because he knows that he's got to deliver their party political message for their future election campaign. He can't answer the questions in earnest. He has to go, well, that's an interesting question. Anyway, back to our campaign strategy. That's what you're seeing here.
For the programme you're now putting forward?
Well, look, I'm here putting forward a programme that I believe is right for the country. When I got this job, wasn't the easiest of circumstances, as you alluded to in your opening, and my first priority was bring immediate relief to people, support with the cost of living, which we've done with energy bills, put a plan in place to stop the boats, and I'm pleased that this year, for the first time since the small boats phenomenon arose, that the numbers of people crossing are down by a fifth, so we are making progress.
But do you...
But now what I want to do is show the country how we're going to change things for the better in the long term. And that means doing things differently, making decisions that will make a difference to people's lives, even if I get criticism for them. That's what the net zero decision was about, and that's how I plan to lead.
But it's interesting because when the public, I think, looks at all of this, sometimes they wonder, you know, this time last year we asked Liz Truss who had voted for her programme, which of course imploded. And the answer then was, I think, around 80,000 Tory party members. You didn't go through a leadership contest. So no one factually voted for the changes that you are now making. And I just wonder if you're
Finally
relaxed about that.
Yeah, because I'm doing what I believe is right. I did that last summer. I stood up for my principles.
Okay, then go to the public. Get a mandate for it. Get a mandate for it from the public democratically. Get yourself elected on that platform. Maybe you'll have a case to make those choices. But democracy works insofar as our elected representatives input policy based upon what they're elected on, which you haven't done, Rishi. Nobody elected you apart from the constituents of Richmond.
I said what I thought was right for the country, and that was that fighting inflation was a priority, and you can't borrow your way out of doing that. I stuck to my guns, and I'm always going to do what I believe is right for the country, and that's what I'm doing now.
But in terms of what the public voted for, so much of the 2019 manifesto that you stood on has just disappeared. You know, you're wobbling on HS2, you've changed the net zero targets, the long-term plan for social care is not happening. Your health secretary admitted to us a few weeks ago the 40 new hospitals.
Hey, Patrick2810, thank you very much for the Prime sub. Welcome to the No Justice stream. Thank you for slinging your Bezos bucks my way this month. All the support always appreciated. And again, if anyone else wants to support my stream today, you can drop bits. With 100 bits gets you text-to-speech. You can subscribe. September is over, but you can still subscribe for free with Prime as well as the regular subscription or gift subscriptions. And people on YouTube, you can become a member for just 99p. You can become a member of the stream. 99p gets you access to my live stream VODs as well as helping to support the stream. Or you can indeed super chat and I will read your message out on stream.
Hospitals aren't all going to be new hospitals after all. You know, your allies are saying now people are going to see the real Rishi Sunak in this second phase. But is the real Rishi Sunak someone who's willing to chuck much of the 2019 manifesto over the side when you've been behind in the polls?
You're saying things that are just not true, saying we chuck net zero targets, but that's just not true.
No, I said
we're committed to our net zero target. We haven't shifted them. They remain exactly the same. They're legislated.
Yeah, it's true. Like previously we had a target that we were going to miss. And now that target is the same, but we're now missing it even harder. We're now missing all of it.
How we get there is always a matter of government policy. The targets are the same. It's wrong to suggest that the targets have been changed. They haven't. It's wrong to suggest that they've been watered down. They haven't. They're set in law.
But the dates of how you get there have shifted.
But there are over 100 different policies to help us get to net zero. They weren't all in the 2019 manifesto. The government constantly has a programme of figuring out what the right way to get there is. I've charted a different way to get to the same destination. One that will save families £5,000, £10,000, £15,000, I think is right. But you ask your fundamental question.
But yeah,
He entirely incinerated all his principles during COVID because they hit against reality. When he returned to his principles, he reinfected half the country with COVID. I mean, but in general, right, it must have been incredible watching Rishi Sunak for the entirety of the period of the pandemic be forced into completely abandoning neoliberalism, abandoning monetarism and going, we have to shut down the economy to save people's lives. We have to implement furlough to ensure that people keep their jobs whilst the economy gets shut down to protect lives during a pandemic, right? Him in number 11, he must have been absolutely seething with rage at the idea that maybe we couldn't just do completely unfettered markets forever and sometimes the state had to step in to help people, right? But now that the pandemic's over, he's completely unshackled, right? He's now got the grip on power as Prime Minister. He's not being cornered by Boris Johnson wanting to do populist policy rather than neoliberal policy. And he feels like, I finally have the power to be set forth and unleashed. Time for all of the tax cuts. Time to abandon a bunch of state commitments.
The major question is look, I'm doing what I believe is right for the long term of our country. I'm prepared to change things. I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to do what I believe is right. I get that people will be critical of that. I'm okay with that. I'm going to be guided by what I believe is right. I believe that what I'm doing is right for the British people, whether it's a new course on net zero, which will save them money.
If you think that it's right, then let the people vote. Let us vote on it.
Fucking neoliberalism.
Hey, Foxter with another Prime sub. Again, welcome to the stream today. I hope you're doing well. Thank you very much for the Bezos bucks again today. Again, if he wants to get proof and get popular consensus that he has the right plan for Britain, then by all means, go to the public. Share your vision for the country. Let's vote on it. Let's have a democratic mandate for the changes that you're making. They literally failed in every part of their manifesto. Be it inflation, immigration, housing, education. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they absolutely failed. And they failed mostly after Boris Johnson had gone. But of course, the thing is, I think I can cut some slack to the first couple of years. You know, it's difficult to try and do everything whilst dealing with a pandemic. I get that was a problem. And now post-pandemic, pandemic, they have the chance to hit those targets, and they're just not even bothering.
Money, whether it's putting in place legislation that will enable us to stop the boats, because it should be the British people that decide who comes to our country and not criminal gangs. These are the types of decisions that I'm going to put in place because I believe they're right.
And we're hearing loud and clear that you might keep changing things. There might be more to come if you think that's the right thing, even though they're not things that the public voted for at the last election.
Look, I have a good sense of what the British people's priorities are. I'm going to set about delivering for them.
I mean post-lockdown, really, right? Post-lockdown, post-furlough, right? There's no lockdown at the moment, right? The pandemic may still be happening, but the government has more time and energy to do other things other than just pandemic management. That's what I really mean, though.
And that's a change that I'm going to bring. I do want to change things. I'm absolutely here to change our country for the better. I believe that means you have to do politics differently, and that's what you saw on Net Zero. That's what you've seen from me before, and that's what you're going to keep seeing from me going forward, because I can lead this country in a different way and ensure that we get our country on a path to a brighter future. That's what this conference is going to be about, and that's what my leadership is about.
And you mentioned there you feel you've got a good sense of where the public's at. Let's look at what the public associates with you and we asked them. Now, we did this with Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader. We'll do it again with Keir Starmer.
Tell them to call an election, right? Say, okay, Rishi, you think that you know where the public's at. Okay. You think you have the best interests of the public at heart. Okay, sure. Why don't we test that by getting an electoral mandate for the changes that you've made that was not there in the manifesto? If you genuinely believe you have popular support for your policies, go to the population with an election. I don't even care about Labour winning. I'm not one of these get the Tories out people, because I fundamentally believe that Labour and the Tories are two cheeks of the same arse, in the words of one of the SNP MPs who got hounded out by the Speaker for it, right? I don't believe that these people are very different. What I do believe is democracy. I believe in a democratic mandate for the positions that you take. And there's no democratic mandate for any of the stuff that Rishi Sunak is advocating for. No democratic mandate whatsoever. If you want to do it, you have to get your democratic mandate from somewhere.
We're using what's called a word cloud, asking people what they associate a leader with, and we can show our viewers that with this morning. Now, you can see there, rightly or wrongly, what many people associate with you is your personal wealth. What does that make you think? Does that worry you if people might feel you're out of touch? Or perhaps, you are very wealthy. You could be living on a beach, not working at all. A lot of people might think, well, you've got all this wealth, you could do anything good on you for being in public service. But what goes through your mind when you see...
Yeah, public service, by which he means ensuring that loads of government contracts get given to subsidiaries of Infosys, or part of their share portfolio, him and Akshata Murthy.
See that?
My job is to deliver for people. And that's why we've just been talking a lot about this net zero decision, which I've made.
I think people would really like to know what your response is. We've talked about the net zero target
but this is a great example of it. That is a decision which was motivated by me wanting to ease the burden on families. And again, I might get lots of criticism from people about that, people who could happily afford to rip out their boiler, install incredibly expensive energy efficiency upgrades in their rural home that's off the gas grid, or change their car sooner than is necessary.
Gordon Brown stuffed the democratic mandate. Now they intend to sit in power as long as the law allows. I mean, that is true, right? If Gordon Brown had actually called the election in 2007, he probably would have won. And then you would have had, an extra couple of years to prove that the Keynesian response to the GFC was the correct response. But, that all got torn by the wayside as Gordon Brown tried to cling on to power for too long, hoisted by his own petard, a victim of his own hubris.
Might be fine for them to do all those things. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's necessary. I want to save families that 5, 10, 15, 20,000 pounds. That's why I made the decision I did.
Again, I want to remind our viewers that those figures are disputed, but you clearly feel good about what you're doing.
You keep saying they're disputed. I mean, literally, you can go online. If you live on an off-gas grid property that currently doesn't have an EPC rating that it was legislated and meant to get to, and then go and ask someone, how much does it cost to upgrade the energy efficiency of that home and put in a heat pump in it?
Yeah, if you're a landlord, landlords are the ones who have to do that, not domestic residents and owner-occupiers.
Come back and they'd say £20,000. It's not a made-up figure, that's fact.
I'm not saying they're made up, but the scale of how many families this would actually affect is something that is not entirely as has been presented.
Quite frankly, I don't care about landlords. I just don't care, right? Whereas now, the cost of lower energy efficiency, so extra energy costs for heating your house and keeping the lights on, that extra cost is now being pushed onto the tenants of the house. All he's done is shift the burden of ensuring energy efficiency from the landlord onto the tenants, because of course 26% of Conservative MPs are landlords, so they only care about the interests of the property owning elite and not indeed regular people who are at the behest, at the mercy of the landlord class in this country. Just like the cladding, exactly, right? Just like the cladding. Although to be fair, load of landlords having to sell up because they can't afford to replace the cladding, which I think is kind of funny. But the fact that the actual constructors, the leaseholders of these big flat tower blocks are the ones who get away scot-free from the cladding issue you, and it's individual investors in individual flats who are the ones who are getting screwed over by it. You must think we're all thick. All the politicians think we're thick.
Been impacted by these things, and that wasn't right.
We're almost out of time. I just wonder, you took over after, you know, such a crazy time in our politics. You've had now nearly a year in the job. You must sometimes think about your predecessors, your former colleagues. Who's the better Prime Minister, Boris Johnson or Liz Truss?
Look, everyone has great strengths, and everyone brings something different to the job. I'm not interested in the past, though. I'm interested in the future and what I can bring to the job, and that's what I think the country wants. And what you're going to get from me is...
We've got a really short amount of time here, Rishi, so I'm going to ask you a really, really unimportant and completely pointless question. I know that there's loads of issues with the cost of living, but let's talk about your weird anti-war on motorist stuff, some stuff about net zero, and whether or not you think Boris Johnson was better than Liz Truss. Let's just avoid the cost of living crisis. Let's avoid the housing crisis. Let's avoid all of that and discuss the real important issues, which is, will you stop the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit?
Someone who does what they believe is right for the long term of the country. I'm not going to take the easy way out. I'm not going to focus on the short term. I'm going to focus on doing what I believe is right in the long term. That's the leadership that I'm going to bring. I spent the first year stabilising things, making progress on bringing inflation down, reducing the number of boat crossings that are coming, and now I'm going to set out a direction for our country that will lead us to a better place that involves doing things differently, that involves bringing change, but that's what I want to do. I want to bring the change, and that's what the country wants.
And you're clearly pitching yourself as a change candidate.
Yeah, literally, she's here saying, oh, well, you're pitching yourself. Yet you've allowed him just have a situation where he's trying to pitch his new government, right? At no point you've actually scrutinised him other than in, like, one question on HS2 he got proper scrutiny for. The rest of the time, you've just allowed him to use what should be a scything indictment of his failure as Prime Minister, and you've just allowed him to use it as a party political broadcast. This is pathetic.
The person who wants to, and believes he is the change candidate, of course, is Keir Starmer. Now, politics can be brutal, but it's not all rough and tumble. So I want to ask you, is there anything you admire about him? And I'll give it away. We're going to ask him that next week.
Look, great. I'm not interested in talking about personalities. People can make up their own minds. I'm interested in setting out my vision for the country, and people can make their own judgment. But what I would say is that you've got to take a stand on things. You've got to take a stand on things. Right? I don't expect everyone to agree with me on everything, but people will have a clear idea of what I believe, what I stand for, and the direction which I want to lead the country. I don't think actually saying nothing, hiding is the right type of leadership. I think that's an abdication of leadership, quite frankly. I'm interested in setting out a clear set of policies, a clear direction of travel based on my values, which I think are the values shared by the British people, and that's how we're going to do things now. Okay. We're going to do things differently, we're going to change how we do politics, and that's how we're going to change our country.
Prime Minister.
You're going to change how we do politics to make it even more cynical, with even more lies and even more political manoeuvring and even less sincerity, right? This is with long-term decisions for a brighter future, otherwise known as short-term decisions for political gain for Rishi Sunak. Incredible. Like, the way he just kind of reframes reality, it's very kind of hyper-normalization of, you know, the 90s, the early 90s Soviet Union, yeah? Everything falling apart, but nobody can talk about it. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.